Welcome and good afternoon. Today's webinar, Data-Driven Compliance, Applying Thoughtware and Software to Achieve Competitive Advantage in Life Sciences. This is another in CoreData's compliance webinar series. Each webinar is designed to provide you greater understanding of issues and challenges confronting compliance professionals. Our hope is to simplify what appears to be the complex world of compliance. Today, we're fortunate to have Trestle Compliance partnering with us on this webinar. I am Jim Dawson, Vice President, Compliance Solutions at CoreData, and I will be serving as your moderator today. I have over 30 years of pharmaceutical and biotech experience with approximately 15 years of experience as a compliance officer. Developing and implementing an effective and efficient compliance program that meets government expectations while providing your company a competitive advantage is challenging, especially when you're trying to create the right corporate culture. As a compliance officer, I found some of the most difficult questions I had to answer were, how do you know the compliance program is working? Is it going to prevent the government from investigating us? Have you correctly identified high-risk activities? How do you know? Have you taken the appropriate corrective actions, and are they working? How are you measuring your compliance program success? Do you have any benchmarks? Can you assure me the compliance program won't prevent the company from being competitive in the marketplace? Without an effective compliance program that includes monitoring and data analytics, you cannot answer these questions with confidence. We try the best we can with the resources we have available. Therefore, we need to constantly rethink and improve our approach to compliance. Next slide, please. Today, we continue to process to help you rethink your compliance approach. Today, looking at how Thoughtware combined with software can provide your company a competitive advantage. Providing us with a look at how we can achieve this within your company, we are fortunate to have Steve Vinci, the founder, CEO, Trestle Compliance. Steve, prior to forming Trestle, he split his time in the private sector career between service and in-house or outsourced Senior Vice President or Chief Compliance Officer for several life sciences and healthcare companies, and as a consultant forming his own firms, as well as serving as a non-equity partner for a Big Four firm. He's been a counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives Oversight Committee. He has 25 years of experience in regulatory compliance matters, from government policy and enforcement to private sector business implementation consideration. Steve has been involved in some of the high-profile cases, compliance cases that we've seen in the last, I'd say 25 years or 20 years, starting with the big TAP case that we all probably are aware of, which at $885 million was for many years the largest settlement in the pharmaceutical industry, and which directly led to key reforms that changed the commercial compliance practices, such as OIG compliance guidance to pharmaceutical manufacturers and pharma code. There are many more things that I could go on and on about with Steve, but he has been a service as a compliance expert. He's been an IRO for CIAs. He's a certified as a privacy professional by IAPP and as a OneTrust privacy professional and corporate partner. He's got global experience ranging from US, Japanese, European companies, and more importantly, and I think we all owe him a debt of appreciating gratitude, he was an officer in the US Marine Corps, received various citations and decorations, and went on to law school, where he got his undergraduate degree at Columbia University, his JD at Southern Methodist University, and will go on with several of his other masters in international comparative law with distinction, an MBA from Chicago Booth School of Business, and he's been a guest lecturer. Steve, I turn this over to you, and I'm very honored and privileged to be with you today. And I really look forward to seeing how we can use Thoughtware and software to gain a competitive edge. So I turn it to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon to all fellow compliance professionals and fellow life science business professionals. After all, we want to be compliant to engage patients and healthcare professionals successfully and to bring the products that are life-changing and amazing to them in the right way for the right reasons to the right people. So next slide, please. I'm very excited to be here today with Jim and Core Data because I really think as much as we've heard about the lengthy past and everything that's happened, it's really all about the future. And the future has brought a lot of change to our world. Certainly we're living through it and sort of bracing ourselves as we wake up in the morning and look at the headlines. And we've got some headlines to go through here. So setting the stage, our agenda, we're going to talk about the Department of Justice, the DOJ, expectations of compliance programs. And why does that matter? And then talk about the top 3 questions that boards and CEOs ask that we need to be responsive to as business and compliance professionals. And then talk about the solution that Jim referenced, how we combine Thoughtware with software to address the modern challenges of life science businesses and compliance programs. And the result, an effective compliance program that should give you, and in my experience, does give you a clear competitive advantage. And we'll like to open it up to some Q&A and discussion at the end. So with that in mind, let's get started and set the stage. Next slide, please. So the Department of Justice 2.5 or so years ago issued a new directive, an evaluation of corporate compliance programs, and it was updated in June of 2020. In it, it established 3 fundamental questions that their prosecutors need to answer. And that's an important fact that this is in the context of a criminal prosecution. So it's important to understand pretty serious, ominous context here. So number 1, is the corporation's compliance program well designed? Number 2, is the program being applied earnestly and in good faith? In other words, is it adequately resourced and empowered to function effectively? Does it work? And does the corporate compliance program work in practice, not just in theory? Next slide, please. So as you read through this rather lengthy legalistic memorandum, there are 2 critical factors that jump out that are important for us as professionals to isolate and identify. So number 1 is design, whether the program is adequately designed for maximum effectiveness in preventing and detecting wrongdoing by employees. So the design of the program, the structure of the program, and we'll talk about it here in a few slides, the 7 elements that the Office of Inspector General issued back in 2003 for pharmaceutical manufacturers on the heels of the TAP case, something I lived and breathed for several years. And so the design is important, the structure of the program. But number 2, just as important, is whether or not the company, the corporate management, is enforcing the program and again, this is where we get some insight into, unfortunately, the inherent skepticism of federal enforcers, where they account for tacitly encouraging or pressuring employees to engage in misconduct. That's the expectation, if you will, and we've seen it in a separate context on the special fraud alert from the OIG back on November 16th of 2020, where, again, they expressed specifically their great skepticism in the value of speaker programs. So more about that later, but here, as a broad matter, design and enforcement are critical factors in order to meet DOJ expectations. We'll talk about how we do. Next slide, please.
Steve, Jim? Before you move on to that next slide, when I hear you present this, especially when you talk about maximizing effectiveness, Yeah, as a small to mid-sized company, I get a little nervous, I get a little concerned that I don't have the resources or infrastructure to assure that the company can meet that standard. So there's a sense among many compliance officers and some company executives that the DOJ understand and that we don't need to meet that stringent standard of maximum effectiveness. What do you say to them?
First of all, great point. Scalability, which is the issue you've identified, and rightly so, has been a topic of concern and conversation in different sectors of healthcare. In the medical billing industry, for example, back in the late 90s, where I wrote the first draft of the OIG compliance guidance, that was a key concern of these small privately held companies. Moving forward now to the present day, small startup biotechs that may have been R&D companies and are at the pivot point of transferring to becoming a fully integrated commercial company have that exact same question. So particularly in the biotech, specialty pharma, rare disease space, what you've asked is exactly on point. And those are the kind of companies I've been working with over the past 5.5+ years. And so the answer is scalability is, yes, recognized as an important issue. And you don't need to be a Pfizer to be effective, in other words. And that's where we can help identify how to scale and what to scale, and also the time frame. One analogy I like to use in this regard is that in the past, say 20 years ago, compliance was sort of a bolt-on, clunky process. It was after the fact, it was expensive, it was time consuming. But now, much as the science has identified engineering, you can engineer a DNA and solutions to diseases by individual now. It's amazing how detailed they've broken down the science. But similarly, I'd like to think that we have similarly broken down the science of compliance to match with the scale of a company's needs and their commercial operation. So that's why I like to say we fuse compliance DNA with commercial DNA in a pattern that is supportive of the business and doesn't do too much. Nobody wants to go bankrupt being compliant, right? So great question. And that would be my answer. A, the government gets it. Scalability is important, but B, we're here to help you figure that out quickly so that you don't have to sort of start and stop and spend unnecessary funds on that effort. But great point.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so here again on the risk assessment, this has been identified again by this Department of Justice Evaluation Compliance Program document to be the starting point. And they go into some detail on the risk management process in terms of how you identify risk, that you identify the key risks in your company business operation. So number one, you need to understand your business, not just the law. You need to tailor the risk assessment to your actual commercial operations, your products, your audiences that you're going to speak to. How is it an injectable product, which gives rise to more nurse practitioner interactions with patients? That gives rise to HIPAA concerns, patient support issues. All of these kinds of risks need to be factored in. And then your resources, do you put your money where your mouth is? Do you allocate your resources and spend on your highest risk? Or do you spin your wheels on low risk areas? So again, risk scoring of your risk and then applying your activities, compliance activities matters from the Department of Justice's perspective. And then finally, most risk assessments are deemed to be a snapshot in time, but that's not enough. You can't just sit on that snapshot. You have to keep it fresh and up to date. And so it talks about updates and revisions. And so as we go to the next slide, let me pause and get my plug for my computer because I've just gotten a warning on the low battery. So, but we're prepared. And so just a moment, let's go to that next slide and I'll be right back with the plug.
It's always nice to have power issues when you're right in the middle of things. You never have the power cord right there with you. Hopefully we get going here real quick.
Yeah.
Scene came back, so.
Yes.
but
Good to go.
risk is,
That's right. Uh, as all good Marines say, adapt and overcome. And so we're plugged in and ready to go. So here we go. On the updates and revisions, again, the Department of Justice gets rather specific. Is the risk assessment current and subject to periodic review? What does that mean? Well, in practice, it's anywhere from an annual or biannual refresh. And it doesn't have to be a complete full-blown risk assessment. It can be a partial risk assessment. To give you a sense, when we conduct risk assessments, it's a multi-tiered process of fact gathering. We first request extensive documents, review all the documents. Next, we schedule interviews with key executives and employees to get direct human feedback. Next, we have a proprietary software risk assessment tool where we ask the people we interview to score key risks that we've identified over time that are relevant in commercial operations for life science companies. And we juxtapose that against our own scoring and see if there's any kind of perception gap. And then that's all put together. So on a revision, you don't necessarily have to do all of that, but maybe you do the automated scoring to see if there's been progress. Again, the more you can quantify items, not just for the DOJ, but frankly for your board and executives, the more you speak their language. One of the things that's really important to understand is that compliance professionals need to speak the language of business in order to be to win the trust of business than their audience. So number two, is the periodic review limited to a snapshot in time or based upon continuous access to operational data and information across functions? This is where, again, I mentioned the term continuous credibility. The Department of Justice is looking for, and they're very specific, continuous access to operational data. So what's been huge that's changed since the 90s and early 2000s is not just the availability of data, but the ability to analyze that data. The government does it. That's what has given rise to all these transparency reporting requirements. It wasn't just to be a bureaucratic pain in the neck on an annual basis, which it likely is, but really more importantly, to have that data so they can review it, slice it, dice it, and associate it with different companies, different activities. Guess what? You can do that too now, and we'll share with you how you can. And then finally, has the periodic review led to updates in policies, procedures, and controls? So this is a very important point that I think some people may gloss over, and that is that it's not just a risk assessment for the risk assessment's sake. It really needs to cascade into each of your individual compliance program elements, again, on a risk prioritized basis, so you can demonstrate to your internal team and business first, but then if called upon to any external authorities, that you are truly living the world of risk and applying what you've learned to improve and keep current your compliance program elements to make sure that, in other words, they work. Next slide, please. Now here, fast forward from 2020 to 2022. About 9 months ago, at a speech at NYU, Assistant Attorney General Kenneth A. Polite, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly, issued a fairly important speech, and in it he stressed, and this reinforces what we just went over, that policies, training, and other processes, again, that sort of code for the 7 elements, should address relevant high-risk elements of the company's business model, that the company needs to, quote, continuously testing the effectiveness of its compliance program and improving and updating the program to ensure that it's sustainable and adapting to changing risks. And then finally, how a company measures and tests its culture and how it uses the data. How it uses the data from that testing is important. That these are the expectations. By the way, having served in the government myself, I can tell you these speeches are not just haphazard. They're not coincidental. They're planned, they're reviewed, they're prepared, and they're approved by senior members of the justice. Why? Because they want to get out a specific message. So whenever they provide these pieces, these glimpses into their thinking and prioritization, we should stand up and listen. Next slide, please. So here are the 7 elements, or the quote, the other process processes in the compliance program. We know them by heart. I won't spend time reviewing them, but basically these are the core elements, the minimum elements of any compliance program. These were established back in 2003 on the heels of the TAP case, which drove this. So yes, TAP was to blame and at the time. So next slide, please. Now here, most recently, here in this past September, less than 3 months ago, the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, issued a memorandum. And this has now become a bit of a tradition where the Assistant Attorney General from the Department of Justice with administrations. And just so you know, I did some research with the Congressional Research Service as a staff member on Capitol Hill, where we were overseeing executive functions. It takes a good 2 years for an administration to really get all its people in place, to get his feet on the ground, and really to set his priorities. And so here we see it, about 2 years after the Biden administration took office. And so the Department of Justice is setting its priorities in this memorandum, and they're sending a clear message not only to their own people, but to everyone outside. Now, I did have the honor and privilege of speaking with the former Attorney General, Dick Thornburgh, also former governor of Pennsylvania, back in the late 90s, and at a presentation in Washington. And he took me aside and he said, Steve, when the Department of Justice makes anything a 1, 2, or even 3 priority, people should understand it's guaranteed that 2 things will happen. There'll be more indictments and more convictions based on those priorities. So again, we really need to pay attention when this kind of information is presented. So here, what does it say? Again, the key, I think, takeaways are highlighted in yellow, that the memorandum provides guidance on how prosecutors should ensure individual and corporate accountability. And number 2, that the department's first priority in corporate criminal matters is to hold accountable the individuals. Notice it doesn't say and corporations. It says the individuals who commit and profit from corporate crime. That's their first priority. So again, what does this mean? Next slide, please. And why does this matter? Next. Well, enforcement risks are increasing. Next. And this is what can happen. So a little morbid humor perhaps, but most CEOs are relatively tall, whether they're men or women. And there's been studies as to why that is. So this guy's incredibly tall. He's 6'6". So, but he's a young guy. He's an up and comer. But this can happen. And again, not to make light of it, if anything, we really want to stress the relative risks here are quite serious. We're talking about federal criminal convictions. And so next slide, please. So let's get specific. Let's get specific about what the topics, what's the substance that the Department of Justice and OIG are currently focused here on in life sciences in 2022. Number 1, and this has been number 1 for years, kickbacks leading to false claims. The Anti-Kickback Act, which is essentially the Domestic Corruption Act. We've got the FCPA for foreign corruption, but the Anti-Kickback Act stems back to the Civil War eras, but it basically is the Anti-Bribery Act here domestically in the U.S., which leads to false claims, which is a civil act that leads to multi-million, even billion-dollar penalties. How does that manifest itself here within the life sciences? Well, speaker programs, number 1 again. A lot of attention on speaker programs since that special fraud alert from the OIG, which has also been taken up by pharma, the Pharmaceutical Research Manufacturers of America. Number 2, consulting arrangements or any kind of fee-for-service arrangement with a potential or actual prescriber, with healthcare professionals or HCP. This is where fair market value, what we pay them and how we determine what we pay them really matters. Transparency reporting, again, these requirements have been increasing over time under the President Obama's administration on the Affordability Act. We implemented the open payments, the federal transparency reporting. The hope was by those of us around before that is that the mosaic of individual state reporting requirements, starting with Vermont and Massachusetts and Miami-Dade, et cetera, would hopefully go away into one federal requirement. But guess what? Now we have all of the above. But very important that where we document and report what we spend on people. Again, the concern, the skepticism is that the pharmaceutical companies are bribing docs to prescribe their products. Number two, drug pricing. Again, the recent legislation this year has changed that dynamic. We'll see how that plays out. But drug pricing cuts across all demographics and is relevant to all citizens. And so as a political matter is a hot topic. Number three, HIPAA, privacy, protected health information, PHI, has really come surfaced in a dramatic way, in a way we hadn't seen pre-COVID. Given this Zoom electronic communications where sales folks have been dependent on, well, they're now back in the field, but also the combination of rare diseases that need patient support has given rise to the potential of protected health information being transferred, and therefore it's up the ante for ensure you have the proper protections in place. And number four, off-label promotion, that certainly garnered the biggest settlements back several years ago. That has tapered off a bit, as I understand from my research and discussions with professionals, because the First Amendment defense is getting traction. And so that's been more difficult to prosecute, as I understand, directly from prosecutors, but it's still up there. So next slide, please. And in case there's any doubt that the OIG isn't moving forward and looking to get multi-billion-dollar recoveries, and understanding that there was a bit of a lull during the previous administration with COVID, here's the semi-annual report from this year, where again, 2.6 billion is the expected recoveries, 640 criminal and civil actions, and over 1,000 exclusions. And that was just for the semi-annual report. So again, in case anyone's doubting that these priorities are not being met, I think these facts, these statistics help disprove that. Next slide.
Steve, before you go on, we've been hearing about this enforcement piece since you were involved with the TAP case and the DOJ, that the DOJ and the OIG are stepping up their enforcement, and they have continually to this day. Do you feel that CEOs and the board of directors are as concerned or more concerned than they were back with the TAP case and some of the earlier settlements? Do you think they still see the importance and the concern around enforcement?
Yes, short answer, I do. And if anything, I think the current generation of CEOs and certainly of senior executive sales and business commercial leaders is that they've seen the corporate carnage from the past. They've lived through it as more junior people, and they're pledged to say, not on my watch. But that said, they're under short-term quarterly pressures to perform. If they're a public company, they're under a lot of pressure, and so they don't have all the details certainly at their fingertips. Some more than others who may have lived through corporate integrity agreements. But certainly, I think all CEOs want to get it right, not necessarily for some moral reason, although I'd like to think so. But that aside, it's part of their job, and they're there to do a good job. So my experience has been that CEOs, actually, and this leads to our next slides, ask the following questions. So the top three questions of boards and CEOs, something that all senior compliance officers encounter, are the following. Next slide. What do we need to do? Something real basic, simple, and right to the point. What do we need to do to be compliant? I think that's the number one question. You tell me, Mr. Compliance or Mrs. Compliance Officer, what we need to do. And back it up, by the way. What are other companies doing? Right on the heels of what do we need to do? Well, we don't want to be too far out there. If we don't want to spend more than we have to or should, but we still want to get it right. So what are other companies doing? Can you tell me? And number three, how do we know our compliance program is working? Or this plan that you're proposing is going to be effective? Show me some standards, show me some metrics, show me some data, some comparison that gives me some peace of mind so that I can ensure that this company can aggressively pursue its business goals while hopefully understanding we're being safe with the right compliance program in place. Now,
Steve, I hate to interrupt you, but you just triggered something with me, is with the effectiveness and with what you're talking about, the business needs. The other piece of that I always got was, you want it effective, but is it efficient? Are you guys working as efficiently and as effectively as you need to get that effectiveness?
exactly. Bingo, Jim. Again, a good compliance officer runs their department like a business. It has budget and they're accountable. Like all functional heads, compliance is no different. And so certainly with a smaller company you mentioned before, either a startup or where they're just getting ready to shift from R&D to commercialization, this is a critical question. How much is enough? We don't want too much. We don't want a platinum gold-plated compliance program like a Pfizer. If we're a smaller company, let's figure out, it goes back to your previous question of scalability. Let's figure out what is right, what fits, what works, what's credible, and yet what's efficient. And efficiency often goes hand in hand with timeliness. Time is money.
Right.
Again, you got to do this quickly, efficiently, and all the more reason to focus on what we're suggesting is the solution. So next slide, please. So can we answer these questions with specificity? Back 20 years ago, or even more, the answer might have been, well, maybe, right? Or, well, let me get back to you. Let me get do some research. Or the typical lawyer answer, well, it depends. Again, very unsatisfying answers to anybody, but let alone, action-oriented, results-oriented boards and CEOs. But today, can we answer these situations with specificity? Well, let's see. Next. Yes, we can. Short and to the point. Yes, we can. And literally with the click of a button, as that picture shows. Let's tell you how. Next, please. So what's the solution? And we've described, Jim and I have described certain fact patterns or situations that may be relevant to each of you in the audience. One caveat here, whether you're big or small, some of these risks really apply to everybody. The expectations apply to everybody, whether you're big or small, whether you're a Pfizer or a Gilead or anyone else, or a small boutique competitor, you need to be compliant. You need to be compliant with the law. You need to meet Department of Justice OIG expectations. The good news is I can share with you, having done business with them directly for well over 25 years, having served in the government myself, knowing how they think and seeing how sausage is made, as they say, in Washington, Capitol Hill. I can tell you that my experiences have been very positive. They're humans too, which in this case is a good thing. But you need to understand, like all good advisors and consultants, how they see the world through their eyes. Put yourself in their shoes. And then once you do that, then also see the world how your CEOs and boards see the world. So here, because time is precious, time is money, and small companies are on a time pressure. They're either, if they're publicly traded, subject to oversight by the SEC and investors, or if they're privately held, subject to their investors there as well to meet certain deadlines. So what we recommend is Thoughtware. What is Thoughtware? It's expertise, it's experience that hits the ground running, strong, dependable support from unmatched compliance expertise for design, implementation, and risk solutions. It's advisory support that's there when you need it, and plus, cutting-edge data analytics for continuous credibility. We've talked about how the Department of Justice is very clear and specific in their expectations of that any effective compliance program, again, remember the context, they're evaluating this program as prosecutors to see if there's a case. Now, you want to make sure you pass the muster there, right? But you want to make sure you don't even get there. That's the real point. You want to make sure your compliance program is effective, is continuously credible. And this is where let's go to the next slide. So this is more of the science, where the result is an effective compliance and competitive advantage, where you essentially supercharge your compliance program with data to provide peace of mind and confidence to your board, CEO, executive team, and sales teams, to enable them to compete and win aggressively, not timidly, but aggressively, and to stay compliant, and you support what you say with evidence, with data, with metrics as much as you can. You present and think like a business person, and demonstrate to them that they can trust what you say, so that their business plans are run through you. And one of the things that I have seen is that it takes time, again, to establish trust in any relationship. But what you want ideally is for the business people and the board to ask you, what do you think, Mr. or Mrs. Compliance Officer, about this business plan that we're having? From your perspective, what do you see the risks as, and how can we address them? That's pulling you in. That's giving you a seat at the table as a trusted executive who has good judgment. And that's where you really want to be, and that's how effective compliance really becomes effective. So we've talked a bit about the science of data and analytics, and given you some specific examples of how you can get real-time data about your competitors in terms of transparency reporting, about any outlier data, whether you're an outlier or not, and what the HCPs you're paying or making from other companies. This can come up in contract negotiations where they make this claim, and you can check, are they telling you the truth, or maybe made a mistake? In other words, there's data now, really, literally a click or two away, that you can get to get this kind of continuous credibility. But another key aspect that we haven't talked too much about, but is critically important, is in the next slide. Next slide. Next. It's the human results. The human results. So you have to touch people's hearts and minds to truly be effective in any endeavor that you do. Here we've talked about the combination of unmatched expertise with data and systems to position you as compliance professionals or as companies to be effective. But here, from again, a professional perspective, a risk perspective, the more you get people juiced up and energized and excited to be part of your company, to be part of that mission, to be part of selling those products to those patients and those doctors, the more they believe in the sincerity and trust that leadership, the less likely the number one risk to all companies manifests itself. And what is that risk? An internal whistleblower, an internal whistleblower. So that for well over 25 years has been the number one source. People ask me all the time, so what's the process? I presented to a board just recently. What's the process of a prosecution? And 9 times out of 10 or more, it's a whistleblower. And how does that work? It's generally several years down the road when a company gets a subpoena that they're first aware that there's an issue. And so whether it's the TAP case or a Pfizer or all the other long laundry list of the who's who of life science companies, more often than not, it's a whistleblower internally that, for whatever reason, gets disgruntled and decides, you know what, I've had it, I'm going outside. So it's touching people's hearts and minds with these very specific processes, with a very technical way of backing up what good common sense often suggests, and to be very knowledgeable on the current state of the current government, the political dynamics there, the priorities of the current administration, why that is. Again, everybody doesn't need to know all those details that compliance nerds like me live and breathe, but you want to be able to get to this point where people say, yes, yes, I'm glad to be working with company XYZ. I'm glad to be selling this. And you know what? I know that there's a great team supporting me because they've proven it. So next slide, please.
Steve,
so, yes, sir.
Before you move on, because I think that you hit on a key part to me, is winning the hearts and minds of not only the compliance people, but all the employees within the organization. And from that is how we as compliance professionals interact with various groups, especially the business commercial groups, being seen as a partner with them as opposed to that policing, we're going to get you type of attitude that I think we've moved away from substantially over the last several years. But I think we need to do a better job of truly understanding how business operates. And there's multiple ways to get to a business solution, not just one way, and help them find how best to mitigate that risk through different options. Is that what you're seeing, or is that something that's still a gap in the with our compliance professionals?
I am seeing that, and as I mentioned briefly earlier, a very pleasant change and surprise is that chief commercial officers, chief marketing, chief sales VPs of sales are initiating the request for compliance support within their own organizations, and then they're given permission to reach out to people like me. That was unheard of 20-something years ago. They were the largest skeptics, the largest people saying, you know what, everybody else is doing A, B, and C that you're saying we can't do. Well, guess what? That's the first sign that there's a problem, usually.
Right.
But I am seeing absolutely that people are embracing the concept. Now, excuse me, I'm getting a little worked up here. It's very exciting to be talking about this for me because of the changes that have been happening. One change I have seen, this is inevitable for new people coming into the compliance profession. You know, as a former Marine, I've often joked, I wish I had my helmet and flak jacket sometimes when I go into compliance meetings, because I mean, just the word itself, I know for me, when I hear it, my body stiffens and I sort of go, what are they going to tell me I can't do, I shouldn't do? And it's not something anybody really wants to hear. And the compliance officer, when they first come in, is often greeted by, you know, grim, hands folded kind of demeanor. That's how I was greeted my very first compliance introduction back in 1995 in Atlanta. And I went home that day and I said, there's got to be a better way. This isn't going to work for me personally. And so let's figure out, how do we make compliance work from a legal perspective, but also from a business one. And that's where I started to realize, and it's taken a long time to really get it down to the nitty-gritty details, exactly how to do this. But it is, as you say, a combination of understanding your audience, understanding the business and the business people and all functions. One change I've seen is now that I think others are likely seeing is that it's not the commercial folks that are resistant at all. If anything, they're saying, help us here, let's get this stuff in place that I know we need to. It's really, frankly, more on the medical side, on the scientific side, where they're not quite as used to this environment where you're limited in what you can say. And the other aspect of this that's really unique is people are used to the very detailed FDA regulations where you got Roman numeral A, little I, it goes to the real minute detail. But this world is different. As we see, there are guidances. What the heck does that mean, right? You got OIG guidances, you got DOJ memos. And you know, the answer to the question is, where in the law does it say I have to do ABC? Well, it doesn't. And so, well, then why do we have to do it? Show me. It's like, well, okay, here's the history of enforcement. Here's the histories of corporate carcasses of settlements. Do you really want to join that list? I don't think so. So, you know, these are guidances, but, you know, they've become in our system basically edicts that if you ignore at your own risk. You can ignore them. You won't be breaking the law per se unless you violate specific laws like the Anti-Kickback or False Claims Act. But anyway, that's a long way of sort of saying that the world has changed. You're right. I think CEOs, to your question earlier, commercial folks are much more conscious, much more sensitive to the need for, much more appreciative of how a good compliance program can actually help their business, can actually make their employees, you know, sort of sit up and go, we're going to go get them, as opposed to sort of shrinking and saying, oh, gee, I'm afraid, you know. And boards too. I mean, let's face it, boards are folks that have likely retired as CEOs or senior people or successful people, otherwise they wouldn't be on the board. And they've been there, done that, seen that. It's really, particularly in the rare disease space, again, it's the scientific community that can be a bit of a challenge at first. However, these are incredibly bright people. They're
Mhm.
often MD, PhD scientists. In fact, a lot of the CEOs of these companies come from that background. And so my dad was a physician. I know you have a very tiny window to win their respect. And so if you don't, you miss that opportunity, you're out of luck. It's much like a sales representative making a detail in front of a doctor. You know, that doctor is a busy person, and they say, okay, tell me what you want to tell me. And if they don't get it right, they don't capture their attention, you know, they're out of luck. They're out the door. So same thing with compliance now within the broader macro sense of the industry. But I think that there's a lot of room for optimism, because some of the things we talked about resonates with these people, these very smart people who are scientists, who are CEOs, with board members. They appreciate good, sound analysis of data, okay? Because actually, that's what they probably do for a living.
Mhm.
But they haven't seen it applied in compliance. So this may be something fresh, something new, something they would be open to, I would suggest. They also appreciate and respect experts, because they're experts. They don't, but they don't suffer fools, as they say. They don't have time to figure out, you either win their respect or you don't. You win their trust or you don't. And so, so as a compliance professional, particularly if you're new, if you're a young up and coming person, I know when I was thrown in that situation back in 1995, I reached out to a seasoned, experienced person who helped mentor and coach me. I think, you know, that's all winning teams, whether they're sports teams, commercial teams, military teams. They tend to stick together, but they also make use of great young raw talent that needs to be coached with seasoned veterans that been there, done that, and can execute and get it done, that you can trust will show up and get that mission accomplished, whatever it may be. And you have to, again, reach into the hearts of folks to inspire and motivate. And that actually is something I talk about in my book, which we'll address, is that, you know, it's about leadership in many respects. And and whether it's compliance or whether it's anything else, you have to be a leader. And to be a leader, you have to lead by example, but and that helps inspire and motivate people. So just most recently, you're talking to somebody about transparency reporting and the need to attest that the data is complete and accurate and thorough to the best of everyone's knowledge. And guess what? The compliance officer and the legal counsel and the business functional heads are all going to be signing off. But before they do that, they want their subordinates to sign off too. In other words, everyone's got skin in the game. And that's the way good leaders lead. That's the way good businesses achieve results. And so, again, part of the message here is that may not be obvious when you jump into a compliance role and you got this sort of mountain, you know, the Mount Everest of compliance regulations. Where the heck do you start? And what's most important? Well, that's where we can help, because we can help really distill it down to the key risks, identify what those risks are, get data to support it, and really help people's job, simplify their job, and make it a lot easier.
Mhm. You know, it's interesting, Steve, because it's been a pleasure listening to you today. But I want to go back to the beginning and where we've ended, because when I listen to you, you start out with, all right, risk is the starting point. At the end of this, it's basically we got to make sure we get it done right with right tools. Then as we go through this, we have to make sure we're updating and keeping on top of this. It's not a snapshot. We got to constantly improve and move forward. And we have to, oh, by the way, we also have to win the hearts and minds of all the employees. And I want to go back to the title of the webinar, which is Thoughtware with Software. So as we're looking at these changes and what you're talking about today, it looks like to me we're looking at a different skill set for some of our compliance people, because now we have to really think before we do, an understanding of the laws, regulations, and the corporation, but we also need to be able to understand data and monitoring and what does that all mean in order to go back and gain that trust you talked about with the CEO and the board. So I'm hearing a little bit of a change in way we in compliance, the skill sets we're going to need to have in our departments, as well as how we operate.
I agree. The world is getting, in some ways, more complex and more sophisticated. I see it with my 11-year-old little girl, the kinds of things she's studying and how she uses computers. Well, first of all, they didn't exist when I was her age, but it's just mind-boggling how kids now are adjusting to this data-driven world. And so as executives that are charged with multi-billion-dollar products and life and death. Let's not forget the context of life sciences is life and death. And the whole reason the FDA came into existence back in the early 1900s under Theodore Roosevelt, because of the egregious safety issues where children died of poisoning, and the meat packing plants were horrendous. So that gave rise to the Food and Drug Administration. And then fast forward to the 60s, when you had the horrible outcomes, and I can never pronounce the word thalidomide. I think
thalidomide.
Thalidomide, yeah, that's it. It's a tongue twister for me. But in any event, that put the emphasis on efficacy. So safety and efficacy in that order are the two top priorities that we should never, ever lose sight of. And I think all good executives understand and agree with that and emphasize that with their tone at the top. And compliance should be seen. This sort of goes into the ethical dimension that we saw referenced earlier in one of the DOJ memos, the speech, I believe, by Mr. Politi, is that it really should be fused with values. Again, that goes to the heart, the inspiration, motivation. It can't be just being law-abiding just for the sake of the law. It has to be for all the right reasons, because that's what people respond to. And actually, it should be pretty easy in this context where, particularly in a rare disease company, where you're addressing, by definition, something that most people haven't or can't, and it's been a debilitating or even deadly disease. As for some of my clients, this is incredible to be part of a solution that helps save someone's life or helps improve their life or extend their life. So each person in that company has a very important role to play. And again, compliance should really emphasize that importance to, again, I'll never forget, just I'll be brief, and I know that we're running short of time. The mother of a young child, a young boy, stared into the camera for this presentation for a national sales conference and said, you know what, I want all of you sales folks to understand that the reason I want you to be compliant is so that you don't jeopardize your company's ability to conduct more research so that the product that you have that currently doesn't work for my son can be improved so that he can live beyond the time that he's expected to live. It was a rare disease. And that was so powerful, so emotional, so true. And the people stood up at standing ovation at this national sales meeting. And that's the kind of power that we need to tap into, no pun intended, and really make sure that we tie compliance with these kind of wonderful outcomes that the industry we work in and support create. And while at the same time being realistic and knowing that there are billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars that generally pay for this, and there have been some pretty significant abuses over the past. So the government is rightly doing their job and making sure that doesn't happen going forward. So if we understand and strike that right balance, then we can get excited, be open to using data in new novel ways, be open to listening to seasoned advice and applying it in a surgical way so that the company can, again, aggressively go forward, compete and win with confidence, knowing that they're striking that right balance between effectiveness and efficiency.
That is a great way, thanks, Steve, to sort of wrap up where we are and get into sort of closing things off, because I know there's some things you have to talk about right after this that we ought to make sure everyone's aware of. So if you want to move to the next slide, would be great.
Yes, please. Next slide. So a little preview of things to come, coming attractions in spring of 2023. Something I've been working on for about 2 years, and actually more a professional lifetime on compliance. I'll be publishing a book through Advantage Forbes Books called Winning with Compliance, driving business performance with integrity. And it's basically my insights, and you got a very small glimpse of that here today, but some detailed insights and some shared war stories and experiences that I lived through, struggled through in some cases, and succeeded in most cases, that I'd like to share, with fellow professionals, with CEOs, with general counsels, with compliance officers, and on the other spectrum with law students, business school students, people that aspire to be in those roles of really. And I take lessons from my Marine Corps days, my athletic days. I was a recruited oarsman in college from prep school, and learning, working with teams and people, and then certainly from my legal and compliance experiences, what it takes to win with compliance, because that's what we want. We don't want to turn it into a set of gotcha, big brother, handcuffs looking over you, but we want to be energized by it, inspired and motivated, as Lieutenant General John Sattler, U.S. Marine Corps, taught me. And so that's to come. And so next slide, please.
Well, I look forward to it, Steve, because I want to read it and get some more greater wisdom from you. So I appreciate that coming out.
Well, that's very kind of you, Jim. It sounds like you certainly have a pretty significant amount of wisdom yourself. And so to learn more about our Thoughtware from Trestle and Core Data, to request a demo, to really get into some nitty-gritty details to see how these applications work, or to register for a free signed copy of my book, please visit our websites at www.trestlecompliance.com and https www.coredata.com, and email, text, or call either Jim or me at the emails and phone numbers there. I know we'll be very responsive and get right back to you. And if we can't, we'll tell you when we can. So please feel free to reach out and touch us virtually, of course, and we'd be happy to do that. And we certainly hope that this has been helpful and a productive use of your time. So Jim, I think you're going to close it up here.
Close it up here with the next slide, please. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And really, Steve, I want to thank you for providing your insights, your expertise, your experience and knowledge with us to help us as compliance professionals do a better job in with our companies and what we do, and using our thinking, our Thoughtware, and then combining that with good old software to move to the next level with compliance and hopefully simplify a lot of what's going on out there. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you everyone. And we want to wish you, Steve and I want to wish you the happiest of holiday seasons. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas.